So this discussion will be kind of question-driven conversation. We have joining us online Verónica Gago, who was with us earlier today, of course needs no introduction, researcher and activist from Buenos Aires. Denise Ferreira da Silva is also online, I see. Hopefully you can all see us as well. And we have Brenna Bhandar, who was with us in real life yesterday, but now she's assuming her virtual self joining us. And so, yeah, I'll pass it over to Shela, but first just to introduce Shela. Shela Sheikh is a researcher and educator based in Paris. And we've had the pleasure of working with Shela in many different configurations, ambling together through publishing and other symposium contexts. And Shela, I think, very specifically to the topic and questions of this convention, is actually preparing a book, a monograph, Rehearsing Environmental Justice. Not sure when it'll be out, but it is in the make. Wherein the crime of ecocide as a violation of both human and non-human rights is examined in relation to a variety of forums for testimony. So, yeah, I'll give it to you, Shela. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Wietske. Thanks, first of all, to Marwa for your incredible energy throughout these days, for the amazing exhibition. Obviously, to Wietske, your partner in crime, Maria, Alexandra, Alejandro, the entire team. Your hospitality has been really incredible, as always, just to note. And also, importantly, for creating this space for rehearsal. We've been speaking about the modalities and the idea of rehearsal throughout the 2 days. I'll keep coming back to this in an abolitionist sense, but just to note, I think it's obvious, but it's worth saying once again, that in a moment like this, this kind of space and also the liberty to speak freely and to really name things for what they are. I mean, obviously we can question the whole politics of naming, but to be able to say things with conviction and without fear of being censored or the repercussions, it's really something not to take for granted. So I do wish to extend my thanks to the team for creating that space. And also just to remember that with the current realignment, political realignment here in the Netherlands, you know, this is something that's under threat as far as I can understand. So Maria, please tell us what we can do to support the continuation of this space. And I also want to extend my thanks to the working group I was part of, the Failing, Doing, Dreaming. It was an incredibly rich day yesterday. So it's a hard task to begin the end, to try and wrap up the 2 days that really do defy summary, and I think that each of us will carry with us and in us in very different lasting ways. So I thought I would try and keep my remarks to a couple of practical issues. But anyone who knows or who organizes knows the practical is always political. So maybe some of these issues that I'm raising will help us to think about how to rehearse the day after. So firstly, Wietke's already mentioned this, but I'd like to reiterate thanks to our interpreters, or this one interpreter up there hidden in the library who can actually see us. And also to Alejandro and Clara and anyone else who was involved in organizing the interpretation. So this might seem like something mundane, but I want to sort of linger on this for a moment. And also to the team at BAK for having reached out to this community of language justice practitioners. It's something I've become increasingly familiar with in my work organizing events in Paris. And I think it's really worth stressing and honoring the work that these people are doing in a very activist way, oftentimes not only in institutions like this, but in activist spaces, working with migrants. So just to sort of give a shout out to them. Yes. We're getting the kind of thank you emoji from up there. Great. So language is something we can't take for granted. We've been coming up against this again and again. We've had some really beautiful reflections on that. Nare presented in a really wonderful way, especially the things that Tarek and Layel and also Yvonne have been talking about in our working group. So I won't go over that. I had prepared some things. But I just propose that we don't underestimate the importance of plurilingualism, which requires the need for the enormous labor and care of simultaneous interpretation, as I already mentioned, which I would propose we also think in the context of social reproduction and cooperative work. And the same goes for practices of editing and translating within attempts at internationalist and feminist publishing. Verónica, I can't see you, but I hope you might say a little bit about this. So thinking about the labor of interpreting in terms of labor issues more broadly and suitable payment for this kind of work, this kind of collective work as well. So let's just remember that there can be no social, racial and environmental justice without language justice. And then the second practical point is also I'd like to give a shout out, as Wietske already did, to Clara and various others for having produced this beautiful gift of the printed reading pack. And it's a pack that contains the texts that were engaged with by the various reading groups around the world. And I actually heard from Aya, who I can't see anymore, that in Jordan, they actually, rather than doing just reading groups, they took the texts and they took them to places that the readings engaged with, which I think is a very practical gesture, which I'll come back to. And so these readers, it's very aptly named a slow-growing reader, nicely making the link between bibliographies and ecology. And as someone who's invested in what we might call ecologies of publishing, I'd like to stress the importance of the production and transmission of these mini archives of critical thinking that circumvent private property, and to emphasize the link between the privatization and extractivism of land and resources on the one hand, and of information and knowledge on the other. So we can recall the entangled histories here of bioprospecting and plant patenting. We've just heard about this with the discussion of the terminator seeds, for instance, and genetically modified crops. But taking that back historically, we can trace these parallel histories of bioprospecting and the conquer of territories and land that runs parallel with the emergence of copyright and intellectual property rights, and also single authorship rights. So we've been thinking about collective practice that sort of pushes back against those sort of varying modes of enclosure and authorship. And so in thinking of these usufructuaries of earth and undoing private property and enclosures, we're of course thinking about open access practices of hacking and piracy, and all questions which are related to seed libraries and germinating resistance, as we just heard about so beautifully. So these information commons, so the transmission of critical tools as well as experiences and stories, importantly, are also vital as a part of an internationalist movement. So I quote here again Ruthie Wilson Gilmore: "Abolition is presence and also process. Therefore, by moving our attention from place to place, it's possible to sketch out the shape and vitality of an internationalist movement in process of becoming itself." So we've been talking again and again about presence. We've also been talking about how to make claims to belonging to land, for instance, when one is in a condition of forced movement, in exile, for instance, or when one doesn't have access to that land. But I just want to stress, when we're affirming this presence, it doesn't just literally mean being present in the room together. Wonderful as this is, we also need these technologies of transmission. So we heard earlier from Clara about the FM radio, for instance, in the mountains and the Andes. I just want to give a shout out to some comrades who've been organizing a radio show. It's called 24 Hours Palestine. It's happened twice already. There will be another one in September. That's bringing together people from all over the world to share their ways of being in solidarity with, we can question that term, but sort of their parallels between their experiences and what's happening in Palestine. And that, on the one hand, it allows people to come together, to transmit live, to listen together and discuss in presence, but it's also a way of sharing things through the virtual world. So the point I just want to make is that we're thinking about presence, we're thinking about land, but that also involves a deterritorialization and a reterritorialization. We're okay to share information about how to have these abolitionist processes in order to bring them back to very situated practices. That's enough of me, I think. So I'm going to ask a few questions. And I'm just going to pose a couple of questions and invite the panel to respond in turn. Everybody has already been introduced, except for Stefano, Harney, who hasn't been here on this stage, who is the author with Fred Moten of The Undercommons. I'm sure most of you know that. And is currently Professor of Transversal Aesthetics at the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne in Germany. So, my first question, okay, sorry, this again will be a little bit long, but. So in the preface to Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson's beautiful book, Rehearsals for Living, Ruth Wilson Gilmore speaks of historical geographies of the future. We can maybe hold on to that term. So the purpose of which, she says, isn't to document that a specific thing happened, but rather to offer thickly analytical, detailed descriptions of many different ways people arrive at arranging themselves in a social force. And as we've seen over and again, this arranging themselves in a social force takes the form of rehearsal. So a form of devising provisional ways to rehearse the future. And this life in rehearsal signifies practices developed in the context of struggle by groups who are themselves transformed by their struggle. So rehearsal here entails the production of things other than what the participants had expected. So it's an embrace of the unexpected and the improvised. So we have that specific sense of rehearsal, which is different to a more literal sense, for instance, within theatre of rehearsing a play, where you set out, you have a goal, and you're essentially practicing to reach some form of perfection, but you know where you're going to. But I would say, and I'm very slowly getting to my question, there is another sense of rehearsal, and I'm here going to quote a theatre director, Zuleika Chowdhury from India, who I've been doing some work with. And she talks about rehearsal as the untidy process of thought and consideration with its related notions of version, repetition, and failure. So these are what constitute a rehearsal, which then proceeds to become the quote-unquote real thing of performance. So that's the standard sense, the sort of literal sense. But then she continues, rehearsal is a metaphor for a way of thinking and an operating strategy. So when used as a strategy, the rehearsal foregrounds that which takes place on the periphery and that which may be obscured by the presentation of a polished and final piece. So I want to just stay with that for the moment. I've already signaled, the interpretation that's taking place on the periphery, the publication practices that are taking place on the periphery. And I want to pose to each of the panelists the question of what it is in your practices or organizing you're involved in, what are the challenges, or maybe think of one challenge that you've had to face that oftentimes gets overlooked? So something really practical that actually ends up informing the content and the form of that which you're enacting. I'm thinking, for instance, Verónica, maybe you can talk about feminist assemblies, but also your feminist publishing practice, or we might hear from Stefano or Brenna, or also Denise about your engagement with institutional policies in academia. We will hear about the Women's Village, for instance, or your own role working with activists, but also within academia. So it's totally up to you, but what are those peripheral practices or challenges that you might wish to bring to the fore? Who wants to go first? Shall we let our online people go first, just so that we don't kind of lose sight of them? Because we can't see you. We've got like a line of text through the image, but maybe Verónica, can I just pick on you because you've got a specific practice that I've signaled towards?
Well, thank you very much, Shela, for this beautiful introduction, and thank you very much the entire team and group of the event. I am very humbled to be here, at least by Zoom, and with dear comrades sharing here the panel and the screen. Yesterday with Lucy in the working session, we acknowledge the collective conditions in which we were able to write our book, A Feminist Reading of Death, because for us, all the political process of organization of the feminist strike was the concrete experience in which we were able to think about a feminist reading of death. So I think this connection between the collective production of the strike and the possibility to think together and to produce this feminist reading of death for us is very much connected. So I am thinking in what you said about these conditions in which we are embedded in terms of processes of struggle, processes of collective production of knowledge. And of course, in my case, it is related also to the editorial work as part of publishing house Tinta Limón, which is an initiative with 20 years. That is, for me, also a very important practice to produce collective knowledge and to distribute it inside, within the struggles and different processes of political organization. So I was trying to connect all this idea that you focus on about ecologies of publication, but also thinking about different circuits of political activism, publication, collective pedagogies, because we were talking about yesterday and this morning also a lot about feminist pedagogies against the abstraction of finance, for example, to confront the idea of financial capital as a pure abstract idea, which is connected to a very expert knowledge of neoliberal economists, for example. And for us, it was very crucial, different initiatives of workshops, assemblies, and popular debates about how financial knowledge is in our everyday economies and how we can confront, use, and also maybe, subvert these financial devices. So the last thing that I want to add now is the concern about internationalism or transnationalism. And I think the first question for us is the internationalism inside our political praxis. For example, the connection with migrant collectives, the connection with comrades that are in other collectives outside, for example, Latin America, for example, in Spain, but are very well connected to the feminist strike, for example. So I am very much interested in how the feminist movement and the feminist practices are developing a sort of a very concrete internationalism from situated praxis and without maybe an abstract infrastructure of internationalism, but at the same time, we need concrete infrastructure for internationalism. So assemblies, publishing initiatives, translation, but also concrete political events are the way that we are doing a sort of rehearsal of that internationalism that we are interested in. Thank you. That's the first thing that I would like to share.
Thank you. And I think I forgot to say earlier that I think that's one thing I've personally really appreciated about this gathering, the fact that so many people have come together with very, very concrete practices, and at the same time we're able to derive some broader conceptualizations from that. Denise, shall we move to you? I think I see you next. So. Oh. Sorry, this is a little bit artificial, but it's what we have to do. So.
We stay in the same continent then. I think it makes sense. Yeah, nice to see many of you again, and people I've seen in different places and even here earlier today or yesterday. Yes, as I'm trying to think about the main challenge, that is one crucial challenge that now I think university professors everywhere, but in particular in the US, will have to deal with, at least some of us whose work touch on colonial racial violence and the critique of capital. But more immediately in terms of the challenges I face in political work, something that I have been dealing for the past 4 years is well, it's practical, but it's not only, obviously, and it has to do with the work with some black women organizing in the periphery of Rio de Janeiro. The work they have been doing, we have been doing because I'm being able to work with them in those years are around food insecurity, ecological devastation, but also primarily economic insecurity, and I'm using their terms for the description of what they use. We could use other terms anyway. But crucial to that is the relationship with the state, which in those contexts is both, that to which one makes demands in order to, for health and infrastructure, etc. But it is also at the same time one of the main enemies, either actively through police brutality or for not acting, for instance, against the deadly militias these women face as organizers. So you have, I think we have a double situation. On the one hand, the fact that physically and emotionally they're dealing with a situation that it is always life-threatening. So once in a while, there is always somebody who has to go away because of death threats, while at the same time you have to make demands to the state in order, so the state would meet, it should meet its obligations. So to me, this raises a general question about how we conceive of political activism itself, and then also how we then deal with the question of the state and organized political work in face of, how do you organize to make demands to the enemy? And what happens then, especially to those of us whose thinking and organizing have always been about, even though I don't agree with it, but it has always been about inclusion and protection, etc. So how do you think of the work? And what we have been doing is precisely, designing both ways of making sense of the situation, but also different praxis so as to face it as it is. And what I find, and that's something, that is the work that I do with them, and that is the fact that I'm far away in most of the time. So when I step out and I'm looking at what's happening there in Rio de Janeiro, but also in other parts of Brazil, I identify some other kind of political organizing that is very different than what we understand as political, and obviously much of it I think should remain there and hidden and doing the thing that should not really come to us, but I think it's important to have that that in account, so we also have the sense that, especially when you talk about internationalism, that this ground is complex, complicated, and that we may have to act in different places without knowing the consequences it will have for what's happening elsewhere or for the demands and needs from other places, just because what's happening there should remain, protected underground for different reasons, including the threat that the state poses to the work. So those are the things that have been occupying my mind in the past for a long time, but more explicitly and dramatically in doing this kind of work, in the past few years. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Denise. Brenna? We'll try and make it a little bit more interactive as we proceed, but I don't want to leave out the people online. Brenna, are you there? Oh, you're actually muted. Brenna, I think you need to unmute yourself. It's not us who's muted you. Oh, I can't. Anyone can help? They're onto it. Okay, so maybe we'll... you're there?
Okay,
okay,
I think
cool.
I'm there, sorry.
And we can see you. Thank you.
I was trying to.
Thanks.
No, that's fine. I think I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question, but I'll try. Over the last 8 months, a lot of my political energies have been taken up with solidarity work in relation to Palestine. And so one ends up doing a lot of that work at the site of the university because of the crackdown and repression on any Palestine-related speech and the refusal of many universities to take the kinds of actions that are being demanded of them. And I always feel very ambivalent about that because at least the institution that I work in is quite a conservative institution that is very accommodating of Zionism and political Zionism and Zionist views. And so one thing I've been confronted with a lot over the last 8 months, and also in relation to the fact that much of the discourse around Palestine has been articulated within legal frameworks, right? A lot of the political discourse has been articulated within legal frameworks. And so, and of course, we know how limiting those frameworks are. So one thing I've been thinking about is the dilemma that many of us face where you can't cede this ground entirely, but you also know that you're not expending your energy for liberation. You're actually expending huge amounts of energy collectively to hold on to some very basic minimums, we could say. And I struggle.
Uh-oh. We'll give it one moment. She's okay. Shall we wait rather than move? I think it's rude to interrupt, but I mean, she left, but. Maybe, yeah, we'll move to someone else and we'll come back to her. Yeah. Lena, do you want to reply in the context of your organizing, be it here or in the village, something practical, like practical challenges that have changed the form and the ideas that come from that? Oh.
I think there's a lot of things that we could speak about in these terms. And maybe as a basic aspect of this works or of this struggle also, I think there's this element that before already some comrades, some friends, they mentioned, this thing of trying to, or building something in the middle of a war, defending at the same time, and also this dialectics of, okay, on the one hand building something, on the one hand defending against something, on the one hand like destroying also the things that we actually want to overcome, and in this like in this process kind of struggling, no? And I think this this is very much a basis of all that like we experience also in the Jinwa, in the women's village, and especially for the question of like how do we understand our struggle, or how do we understand also life, basically. There's a lot of experiences, and maybe just as one example, because I think like the whole point of how do we connect our, like all these dreams or all these concepts and all these aims that we have, or like the things that we are also speaking about these days, no? Like it has a lot to do with like it's a sense of philosophy also, no? It's a sense of thinking differently, but it's also connected with concepts and so on. But like the whole question is actually how do we really like interact on this base in daily life, really, no? Like how really on the ground, in the ways, in the works that we are doing, in the forms how we are organizing with the people around us, what we build, what we fight for, and how can we actually connect this, no? So that we don't lose ourselves in making big concepts and so on. But like the point is, how can I speak about this philosophy, for example, with your grandmother? No? Or like, am I able to do like the things that I'm working on? Can I go to my neighbor and share it with them, for example? No? Like, how much am I able to express the things that I'm fighting for, express the things that I'm working on in a very different languages, no? That are actually like, yeah, kind of connected to the base, connected to like the society around us. And I think this is something very, very important that also is happening in Jinwa a lot of times, because there are so many different women, no? Like women from the villages around, women who study in the cities, women who have years and years of experiences in the freedom struggle, for example, no? And it's very different realities, but how can we, with these different realities, come to a common point of understanding the situation, like the local situation, the global situation, our history, for example, and also the principles that we want to live on together, and how can we like come to this common understanding and then work together with this, no? And then live together with this and really come into this process of, okay, trying something, reflecting, going on and so on. And I think this is something, maybe it sounds very basic, but I think it's very, very crucial, this aspect. And I think it's something that we see also here, no? Like, luckily, really, there's many people like from different contexts also. And I think this is a very crucial point also, no? Like really, how can we bring together our different experiences, different perspectives, but how can we find a common language, a common also strategical understanding actually? And how can we really transform this in daily life also, no? That is not just remaining some like conceptual discussion, but actually is so related to our way of living, our way of organizing. For example, after this conversations, where do we go, for example? No, how do we live? How do we live our relations, for example? No, what understanding of economy? No, how individualist or not individualist do we approach in life, in our whole way of doing things, for example? And I think this is one aspect that maybe I could highlight in this sense, no? Like this bringing together the perspectives, coming to a like way of acting together that kind of unites the big perspectives, principles, utopia with the things that we can do in daily life also.
Thank you. I think we have Brenna back. Brenna, do you want to finish your chain of thought?
Okay, there we go. I was going to say I'm happy to listen to others and come back to it.
Okay. All right, we'll move to Yvonne. Thanks, Brenna.
Thank you, Shela. I think I also just want, in case I don't get a moment to say thank you to everyone who has put the convention together. It's really been an honor and a privilege to be able to gather in this way, to think together, to create together, to think about possibilities, but also to realize our own capabilities. So I've really, really enjoyed being here, and I'm so appreciative. So thank you to everyone. So I've had a lot of challenges, but one of them is geographical. I live in Johannesburg, which is in the city, and many of the people I like to think with and work with and create with are in the rural parts of the country. So what makes my work difficult is because I don't think that I can do this work without literally talking to people and building with people and creating with people and thinking with people. So, but because of our reality, I had to go and look for work in Johannesburg. And so there was a disruption in the ways that the work is being done. So just like at a practical level. So there's a disruption, and the disruption is because of my, I need work. So that's just like just the reality of what disrupts the work that I do. But also, I don't know if this is about process, but I sometimes have anxiety about how it is that I do the research, even as somebody who has access, because I do find that sometimes it can be very extractive, and that I'm already working with people who are exploited, And so I'm always anxious about, am I doing it right? Because, research can be very extractive and exploitative. People can go into communities and their own profiles grow, but nothing happens to the people at the end of the day. So I don't know if this is about process, but it's really like an anxiety really that I have, that you create with people, but at the end of the day, you come and speak as Yvonne, the researcher. So I'm always thinking about that. So I always share, I've now learned to say land workers, what it is that I'm doing and where I'm taking the work that we do. But even as I do the work with my best intentions, I do worry about that, but also the fact that the work sometimes, because I also experience it and I see it, makes people relive traumas. And I sometimes really struggle with how it is that we can do this work in a way that's useful for people, but also be mindful that it can, because it's research, be extractive, but also people can relive their traumas. And then another challenge is that of language, going against language and knowledge systems, because trying to work with people who are deemed in the knowledge system or education system or language system, whatever it is, who are deemed invisible, is difficult because you write as a researcher and sometimes you're required to reference, sometimes you're required to bring evidence, and sometimes you have to go up against words like, how is this tangible? So I just, sometimes when I do the work, I come against a lot of that. Yeah, and in my notes earlier, since people have brought it up already, I think Verónica has brought it up, internationalism. And I like to think about it. You mentioned solidarity earlier, and you were not you're like, just that term. But I like to think about it in the ways that, again, we're going back to Ruthie, because she just has a way of giving us a language to enable us to, think about possibilities and ways to be and think and do. This idea of radical dependency. Tarek mentioned yesterday that the reason why many people relate to Palestine is because it also reflects what their ancestors went through. And that made me really sad, because I think radical dependency should not only be based on the fact that you can relate, but an injustice is an injustice, whether or not you've experienced it or ancestors have experienced it. A genocide is a genocide, whether or not you can relate to it anyway. And so to center it on radical dependency means that your comrade can radically depend on you, whether or not there's a relationality that you establish with what is happening in any part of the world. Yeah, so I was just thinking about how I don't have an answer to it, about how we make this radical dependency possible, because conventions like these bring us to those questions for a reason. I think there's a reason why we are convening here. We're separated by mountains, territories, whatever it is, borders. And that makes the work very difficult. So how do we sustain radical dependency? When I go back, how do I continue to think about Antaziza and Tariq in a way that's, radically, dependent? So I think, these are just those really, yeah.
Thank you, Yvonne. Stefano?
I think there are other people in the panel who are probably better placed than me to answer this question. but I'll try. Yvonne said she needs work at the beginning of her comments. And I think we all do, for the most part, and I certainly need work. But sometimes it seems like my only choice in the work that I can get paid for is either to be a manager or to be an auditor. In the world of the university, that's my role. That's what you do if you're hired by a university. You manage the students on behalf of the administration. I don't want to talk anymore about that because it's obvious and it's just not that interesting. But that's what you do. But if I try to get outside of that, I discover that I'm an auditor. So that's not going well. What I mean by that is, here we are, thanks to Wietske, Maria, and everyone, we're gathering in this space, which essentially is on the periphery, if I can say that way, of the art world. And the art world is moving fast in the way that it is financializing, as you know, right? And we're already really at the stage where there's a kind of tripartite division of labor, right? There is the artist, who essentially is becoming the asset to be speculated on. And increasingly, the new asset class are Black and Indigenous artists, artists of color, which museums who have spent their entire existence excluding them are now leveraging them. You can see this from the list in the art news, whatever it is, of the supposedly most influential. Those people who are supposedly influential are not actually influential, but they are assets. So the people creating, they're in the division of labor, they're assets. The people who are curating, the people in the galleries, are obviously asset managers. And then poor fools like me, and Mao and a few other people, right? We're essentially the credit rating agency, right? We're brought in this, to affirm what what the curator and the gallerist are trying to tell us, This is a very valuable asset, right? So this is the world that we're in, and, I know we've talked a lot about how we try to escape that world. And I'm sure you don't like to hear me talk about you in any of those categories, just like I don't like to talk about myself in any of those categories. So I have some good news for you. We're all going to be replaced. Because we talk about how the art market is being financialized. Sometimes we even talk about how art is becoming liquid, how it's becoming liquidity, and just another investment. But the thing is, that's not true yet. It hasn't happened, right? You can't bundle art with mortgages at the moment, right? Art is not securitized. Even masterworks, for instance, is not really securitized because it can't bundle with other areas because it's not really regulated. They haven't yet trained the people that they're going to train in things like social impact investment, all the other forms that they will eventually use to securitize your art. At that point, they're going to do what they did in every industry, which is bring in their people for these jobs, right? If you think about it, the banks don't go and ask the executive of an auto company what his auto company is worth, right? They bring in their own people to decide on that. And that's what's going to happen when the art world gets fully financialized. I'll be out of a job, right? Or I'll be working for them directly, right? And we've seen this happen in other professions. It happened in the accounting profession itself. It happened in the legal profession. And now it's going to happen to whatever you want to call us, art critics, art, commentators, etc. And it's going to happen to the gallerists, and it's going to happen even to the private collectors. This is about pushing the private collectors away and having the banks take over, having your big funds take over, right? Right now, they look at this art market. I'm going to stop here. Right now, they look at this art market, and they see billions of dollars. And essentially, they're like, this billions of dollars are going to waste. These are in the hands of private investors. These are in the hands of the museum. This is no good. They have to come into capital proper. They have to come into these big funds. Then they'll be fully convertible. Then they'll be fully liquid. And the way that happens, and that happens, is probably going to be through ETFs and a whole bunch of things that we could probably, if we really didn't have anything better to do, track, right, and see the steps in the thing. But in the end, what it will mean is that the art world essentially is subsumed entirely in finance capital, and anybody who's spending time in it will not be the ones who are making judgment about value. They will be the ones working for the people who make judgment about value. So that's why I say, right now I feel like I end up in a position of being a kind of auditor. And the worst thing about it is I'm not even really a good auditor. I'm going to be replaced by a real one pretty soon. Well, I'm not going to end it here. I'm going to turn it over to Brenna, and she's going to solve the problem.
Thank you. Brenna, do you want to come in on this? Finish for Stefano. She's just disappeared.
There we go. I always need permission to unmute I think, for some reason. No, how can I follow that? I'm going to chew on that for a while. I was still thinking about what Yvonne was talking about extractivism. I wonder if there's some way of connecting what Stefano just spoke about with the whole issue of extractivism when it comes to grounded forms of research. But anyways, I don't have anything coherent. I'm going to have to think about that for a while.
Okay, we'll come back to that. I realize time is passing quick, so I have one more question. We'll try and like bounce off each other a bit more if possible. We're thinking about language, but to bring it back to the title of this week, we've been talking a lot about abolition, and we have various other vocabularies. We've been talking about finding idioms, or finding ways to undo the idiom of private property. I mean, as a native English speaker who's also a particularly pernickety copy editor and proofreader, even I have trouble with the word usufructuaries. So, I'm also thinking about this, we were speaking about the kind of accessibility of language and translatability. So, that we're going to have to work on that one. But maybe that's just why we haven't been saying it, because everyone doesn't want to look stupid. Whatever. Yeah, but I do want to get the thoughts of everyone to sort of bring it back to the way in which Marwa, Wietske, and others have framed this, the exhibition and also the Congress. So I won't read out the whole blurb thing. You've got it in your guides, your handouts. Talks about the usufruct and the Latin usus and fructus, translating literally as use of the fruits. I mean, I'm assuming everybody who has come has read this and has some sense of what the title means. But I just want to pull out the bits where you mention how the project Usufructuaries of Earth proposes instead to reclaim its radical potential that grounds Earth's life over capitals. And then later on, you talk about rising up against imperialism and creating a new affirmative world that departs from the hypocrisies and violences of settler colonialism, neo-colonialism, and capitalist exploitation. So there's a few things that I want to ask the panel to respond to. I mean, A, how you understand this title, this proposition, and importantly, how it functions as a proposition, because this is another term that comes up again and again in the programming here at BAK. You know, propositions in the broadest sense, but we've also been talking about artistic practices as propositions rather than simply representations. And we heard earlier today about the sort of violence of that colonial logic of representation, which oftentimes ends up presenting something and creating a reality. We know that from colonial landscapes. So the propositional element, the reclaiming of radical potential, the radical potential of essentially a Latin-based word. So how do we move out of that? I'm also thinking of Brenna, your discussions about the need to critique the language of the commons and commoning, which oftentimes is tied very much to a Western or North American, European lineage, a sort of universalizing tendency. So I put it to the panel, like, what do we make of this term and this gesture? Do we keep it? Do we override it? Do we, I don't know. Who wants to go first? I don't know if people who are online can even put their hands up. And we can barely see you here. Is it possible for them to like raise their hands to say they want to speak? They're not raising. Okay, can I have to pick on people. Brenna, maybe you want to speak about that because I singled you out for the critique of the commons. She disappeared.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Oh, okay, good. So I've been unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a lot I could say about usufruct and
great
and the idea of use. I was going to say, but I'm going to given I want to hear other people speak about this, I'm going to limit myself to sort of two comments or observations from yesterday, the wonderful day we had of discussing so many things that we weren't naming as usufruct, but that are usufructuary, I think. I guess the first thing I wanted to comment on, or just sort of an observation, is that I think a lot of times when we talk about private property and property as a legal form, we tend to imagine it and talk about it and frame it in a kind of absolutist way. So there's either private property or it's not private property, or it's private property or there's some kind of radical alternative. And I think in all of the work that people are doing on the ground to really shatter the legal form of property, we can see that these forms of praxis and action, of course, are existing in a much more kind of ambiguous and sometimes contradictory relationship to existing forms of private property. So if we think about Tarek's work, and he mentioned earlier in the session before this one, how the work that he's doing is taking place on land that's privately owned, but then the whole life world that he's invested in creating on that property does not adhere to the way in which capitalist agrarian forms of use are usually imagined and undertaken on privately owned land. And so maybe there's a question then, the political question comes up of how do you scale that up, right, to expand and augment those life worlds, regardless in a way, I mean, yeah, maybe regardless of what the underlying legal form is. I don't know. I think that it depends a lot on the specific place where that work is being done. You know, another thing that struck me about Yvonne's work is she has a line in the reading that we did in preparation where you know, she says, I've got it written down somewhere, but it's so I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, you know, those who work the land should be its primary beneficiaries. I thought that was really fascinating because beneficiaries, of course, is a legal term that exists within property law, but by saying that people who work the land should be the primary beneficiaries of the land, I think she's again shattering those legal concepts and imparting a whole different concept of use and what that labor or what work, I think she prefers the term work than labor, you know, what that should give rise to in terms of a relation to the land and an interest in the land. So yeah, I think that these kind of contradictions and ambiguities when it comes to the relationship between use and ownership are really fascinating and really, I think, productive ambiguities and contradictions. And then the second thing I was thinking about, and I think you brought it up, Shela, in our working group yesterday, is we've been really thinking a lot about land, agriculture, food production, in our group. And I'm wondering how we connect that to the urban. I really felt deeply my own alienation from land after hanging out in that working group yesterday. But I'm thinking so much about urban struggles and how people develop deep attachments to particular urban areas and urban spaces and in ways that are not exactly like the way that people develop relationships to land in non-urban spaces. But I think these are connected when we think about, you know, territorialization, the racialization of space, et cetera, and many other things. So when it comes to usufruct and trying to subvert or shatter forms of ownership that are rooted in, you know, exclusiveness, speculation, control, etc. How does that reflect on what's happening in urban spaces? So yeah, those are the things that I had on my mind.
Great, thanks, Brenna. It did come up in, now I'm forgetting which plenary, but yeah, bringing it back to the urban, that came up. Yvonne, do you want to respond quickly to Brenna's points and then comment on your understanding of the term?
Yes. Thank you so much, Brenna. Yeah, I maybe to her point about my use of the term, you know, people being the primary beneficiaries of land, people who work the land. I mentioned earlier that people themselves don't always see work as something that makes them suffer. But in the context that they are exploited, it does make them suffer. But also, I was thinking of it also in the context of this idea of being locked on land where you're providing generational labor, but you have you don't benefit really in any way from the work that you put. By the way, not only in the productivity sense, but in sustaining the land. So I think about it in those ways. And yeah, Brenna's also right. I'm very careful, you know, about the use of whether I think I'm using work or labor, because the farm workers themselves, you know, don't refer themselves as laborers, but they do refer to themselves as people that work the land. I think responding to the question, I had difficulty thinking about this one, particularly on the idea of enjoying fruits. When of the land, or whether of the labor, but particularly the fruits of what earth, you know. I had difficulty with that one because in the context where I work, and also in some of the examples that I've seen, I don't know if people are enjoying fruits of earth in the way that we're imagining it when using use of that word, while they are placemaking and are in struggle. I don't know how much of that, the big word, how we imagine it, and how people being placemaking in constant struggle, how possible it is to enjoy the fruits of the earth in the way that it's imagined, as encapsulated by that word. I'm struggling to say it. So yeah, that is my struggle. But also, you mentioned language. I think it's useful as a language, for what it is that must really happen when we think about land in relation to people and people in relation to land. I think it's very useful. But in the practicality of being in struggle and thinking about the day-to-day, are people involved in placemaking in that way, enjoying the fruits of the earth in the way that we imagine? But as a way to imagine possibility, I think it's very useful. And then on language, I'm a fan of language because I come from a family of storytellers. Language can be very powerful in very destructive ways, but also in ways to give you a language of dreaming and doing, as we were talking the past 2 days. In the same way that, sorry to use this example, that shoot can mean kill. It can be an encapsulation of state-sanctioned violence. It can be an encapsulation of power. But in the same way that I used Ngaba, it can be a way to talk about oral history, to talk about history, to talk about culture, to talk about heritage. Language can inform poems. We talked about arts and culture, poems that give us hope. It can inform songs that are useful to keep us going in the struggle. So I think that sometimes, you know, we think of language as language, but if we think of what it holds and what it can make possible, then we can think very carefully. And somebody, I'm going back to her, somebody that does this for me in very meaningful ways, to not only analyze the world, but to give me a language for thinking about possibility, is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. In the way that she talks about organized abandonment, you know, she helped me think about how it is that the state and capital can work together to raise barriers for some kinds of people and lower them. But also in the same way she gives us abolition geography, which is to think of to think or begin from the homely place that freedom is a place, that it is about presence. So she gives us very powerful ways of really unpacking what is happening. That is language. That is language that makes our point about land alienation so much more striking, but also language that gives us a way of speaking about possibility that is just as equally striking. So Tariq, I just keep coming back to you when I speak about language. You know, the idea of place. I mean, to remain, species, capability, mastery. This is the stuff that, you know, we're talking about. And I think we have to lean on language, because we have been disabled from doing that in so many ways, and we have to insist on it. The same way the state, even today, as people go on the street to protest, they will say shoot. So I think we also have to just be as stubborn about the ways in which we use language. Sorry, I'm very passionate about this.
It's great, we need a bit of this at the end of the day. So.
But because, you know, I think we have to constantly search for language that makes possible that what it is that we're dreaming about and what it is that we're trying to do. It is a work of searching all the time, and sometimes it is around us. So sometimes the searching is around us, but also sometimes, in the way that I keep going back to you, I don't think we can overestimate the importance of gathering like this. Sometimes it is in the sharing in this way. So, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Yvonne. We could just end there, but we won't. We only have a little bit of time, and we do want to allow our audience to ask questions. So if there's anyone on this panel who has something really burning to say about this Usufructuaries of Earth, otherwise I'm going to hand it over to questions. Do you want? Yeah, we can go to questions. Yeah? Anyone online? Or there's one question there. I also know there's one question there. Maybe we're going to stack up questions. We'll take both. They might relate to each other.
I have a question for Harney, because you brought up the university, and I'm also at the university, and I also heard you mention that you're at the university in Germany, in the wake of also what's happening in Gaza, the genocide, all of that. I'm really curious what being in a university in Germany during the past 6 months makes you feel about the undercommons after all these years.
We'll take Clara's as well, because they might be related.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Sheila, for the beautiful practical question. Maybe thinking of what Wietske said in the opening statement, she wanted to put these chairs to break up the border between the listener and the speaker and the proscenium. Like hearing all of you speak these days about the macro struggles that you're dealing with, the political struggles, the sometimes abstract and intellectual struggles, and with this division between you as the speaker and me as the listener, sometimes it's difficult to see myself as your peer. Sometimes, you see people as models or elders. So thank you for that practical question to remind us of the common ground that we have in the background. And I feel much closer to all of you after hearing the struggles that, I think I share deeply, all of them. So that was nice. Thank you, Sheila. And maybe coming to this thing of language, I'm not sure if this is so much a comment or a question, but I do deeply agree that sometimes there are these moments, and coming from not just working at an institution like BAK, but doing a lot of community work in the Philippines, where I'm from, which is the lens from which I view almost everything. I do agree that as you invoked like this the task of translation and interpretation is so key to bringing down these abstractions into everyday life. And I deeply, deeply resonate with what you've been saying, Yvonne. Maybe I would like to say that there's also this labor of elevation of vocabulary, especially for those who struggle to find the words because they have lacked access to forms of education. And there are certain words that I ban from my life and my writing: ontology, epistemology, phenomenology, because in everyday life you can say forms of knowing, forms of being, forms of experiencing, and that's how I can talk to my grandmother. Well, my grandmother is no longer here. Maybe my father's a lawyer, so he actually loves the title, Usufructuaries of Earth. But I feel like this word in particular, like when you talk about the elevation of vocabulary and thinking of the Philippines where the peasant struggle is about land reform, if you are a farmer that is hit with, that needs to legally fight for your rights to access to the land reform policy, if you have to review legal documents, you will see the word usufructuary. And in many countries, I think, whose legal codes are based on obscure Latin, we were talking with Grace that community, radical is also, they're also Latin words, but maybe I feel like what are the vocabularies that we choose to define, because they can be tools to move forward in our struggles and to elevate our understanding and to approach these abstractions, these philosophical abstractions that speak at people in registers that they can grasp. It's not that they're unable to understand. I think we mustn't also condescend and think that people close to the land are not capable of understanding vocabulary close to the institution or to the law. Maybe that thing of which languages or which words are we choosing to make accessible, and which words do we find more friendly ways. It's about the use that they have in everyday life. So perhaps not a question, just like a footnote.
Thank you. There could be a lot of footnotes after that. So I'm going to hand over to Stefano, but appreciated your comments.
I'll try to address your question, and I'll make reference to Denise's work, as I often do. The Undercommons is a practice. Right now, it's not much of a practice going on, as you can imagine, in German universities, on the surface, but underneath, somewhere that practice is going on. One place you could think about it with regard to my earlier comments around the coming subsumption of the art market into real financialization as opposed to what we have right now. And I'll be brief about this, but if you go back and you look at the subprime crisis, right? Very shortly, the art world will be in the same position as, let's say, subprime mortgages. They'll be right in the middle of Wall Street, or right in the middle of Frankfurt or whatever, right? What if we thought about the subprime crisis as a general strike? What if we thought about it as a mass refusal? After all, the people who stopped paying their mortgages were precisely those people who know very well that they never really have a home, especially in America. And there are people who are the descendants of those who have led general strikes in the past. And he raises the question of, like, what will our general strike look like once we are fully subsumed, those of us in and around the art world? And will it have the same power that the general strike of the subprime had, which nearly brought down the whole damn system? So that's where I'm thinking about the Undercommons right now, as a practice of the general strike, for what it's worth.
Thank you. Do we have to end now? Exactly, because, yeah. Denise, Verónica, do you want to say any final words? Either in response to the Usufructuaries question or anything we've just heard? You can signal. I can't even see your faces, but you can. The audience will tell me if you're signaling. Who's signaling? Okay, great.
Just a little, very brief comment, because I like this connection between the usufructuaries and general strike, because I think it's one of the terms that we are trying to reinvent, translate, and, for example, how we can organize a general strike in the expanded terrain of social reproduction. So I think this is also a common question of different collectives, movements, especially after the pandemic, where they try to produce a sort of fake general strike, but at the same time, an hyper-exploitation of reproductive labor. So I think that the term strike is that kind of words, of concepts that are in dispute, and it's very interesting to think in terms of uses of time, to rethink general strike. So thanks for all the connections that you were bringing up here, and thanks all the people who are there also participating.
Thanks, Verónica. Marwa and Wietske, you can add time to the first line of the blurb. It was a really nice connection. Denise, do you want to say something? She's good?
Okay, now I'm
yeah.
yeah, I had the same thing as Brenna had before. I just want to say, I take the proposition as an invitation to be considered, and I take it seriously. And so I just want to share with Marwa, and everyone, how I respond to the proposition. And I respond with a split personality, because one side just thinks of the limit. There's a presupposition of legality of property as legal, which I think does not operate in much of the the political situations I'm looking at. And here I'm thinking not only about Rio de Janeiro, close to home, but also the situation in the interior of Brazil, for instance, where land is taken violently without any legal resource. Because so property may not, it's a category that functions, but not everywhere and all the time. And that is, and criminalization is so widespread and now, and so becoming so general that so all the property, like other legal categories, may we have to think about them. So this on the one hand. So I'm thinking about the centrality of property itself, and I understand that several ways in which it is, and that's why I take the proposition seriously. But I'm just wondering, and in those cases where the land is taken and occupied without the law, the law, but obviously always with the support of the state. This on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the affirmation, and I was thinking, okay, so if it is an affirmative gesture, then, and I think that's also related to the criticisms, the critique of the commons. So this affirmative gesture, it takes place under certain conditions, right? So making an affirmative gesture towards usufructus, without attending to the different ways in which those fruits can be enjoyed and are enjoyed, is also something to pay attention. So I take the proposition, but and I like to think with it seriously, but attending to the limits of property and other legal categories in the contemporary political context on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the old theme of unevenness. And that's all I want to.
Thank you. Lena, do you want to say any closing words?
Very shortly, because I think language and knowledge is really one very important point, and also this word that is created maybe in relation to this exhibition. Certainly it's part of a search, no? Like search also for the ability to think in a different way. And I think, but next to this question of like language, I think another point is if we speak about property and the overcoming private property and colonial impact of property and so on. The other question is how much actually are we able to work together on land, or how much actually are we able to administrate land or property, or not even, then it's not property anymore, no? Like, but administrate communally, collectively, no? What are our methods for this, for example? And this, I think, is another very important question. And I think everyone here who worked together on land or who tried to cooperatively work on something, I think knows that it's not so easy also, no? And I think this is also a very important point that we can take from here, like that we really need more spaces to also speak about this. So what are experiences with working together on the land, for example, or with organizing together, for example. We also had very important talks, I think, about like how important is to reflect on the methods that we are using, to not be just short-term, but to really think on a long-term way, how to exchange between different movements, how to exchange also between different fields of the struggle. And I think this is something that we really, where we really need to open spaces where we can come together and also share about this, where we can come to more common strategies about this, and then see how all the different areas where we are working in, like be it like the intellectual work, be it like the art, be it like really the work on the fields, no? All these different aspects, how it can become one like struggle, and how we can also defend each other in situations like, for example, now genocide, no? Because it's all connected, no? Like I think this is something there also important, this internationalist perspective that the other friends were just mentioning. And yeah, so this.
Okay, so just to reiterate, thanks to BAK for creating this space where we did begin to have those conversations, either in the working groups or over a beer or a coffee or wherever, the hotel lobby. It happened, so thank you again. Do you want to say anything?
Really incredible, thanks. I think, well, I would love to...